That paper is worthless, Miss Hartwield. Your water, your land, and your father's name aren't worth the ink they're written in.
My father filed this claim 23 years ago. The spring has always been ours.
It means nothing now. The paperwork doesn't match the land, and the land doesn't belong to you.
I'd like to present evidence on behalf of the Territorial Archive. These documents confirm that Abel Hartwood's original claim was properly filed, properly surveyed, and properly recorded. The only lie in this room did not come from her father.
Picture a young woman standing in a county land office, holding a piece of paper her dead father signed 20 years ago. And picture the richest cattleman in the territory telling her, in front of every rancher and clerk in the room, that the paper is worthless, that her water, her land, and her father's name aren't worth the ink they're written in. Now picture the man standing quietly behind her, a stranger in a plain coat who has said nothing this entire time, who happens to know more about land records than anyone in that building, and who is about to prove that the only lie in this room didn't come from the girl's father. Before we go any further, if stories about quiet people standing up when it counts are the kind you come back for, take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing, and it helps this small channel more than you'd think. Josephine Hartwell, Josie, to everyone who knew her, which in Pinon Flats, New Mexico territory, was nearly everyone, had been running her father's small farm alone for the better part of 2 years by the time this story begins, and she had learned, in those 2 years, that the difference between surviving and not surviving in the high desert came down to exactly one thing: water. Her father, Abel Hartwell, had understood this better than most. He had come to Pinon Flats in the early days of the territory, before the cattle money arrived, and before anyone with real wealth had bothered to look twice at the dry, scrubby country south of Santa Fe. And he had done what careful men with limited means sometimes did in places where the land itself offered little. He had found water. A spring, fed by snowmelt from the mountains to the north, surfacing at the base of a limestone ridge on the eastern edge of what would become the Hartwell property. It was not a large spring, not the kind that could water 1,000 head of cattle, but it was steady and reliable, and it ran year-round, even in the driest summers, which made it, in a landscape where most creeks turned to dust by July, worth considerably more than the 40 acres of scrubland it happened to sit on. Abel had filed a formal water claim on the spring in 1862, recorded it with the Territorial Land Office, and built his small farm around it, a vegetable garden that supplied half the town's produce through the growing season, a modest dairy operation with 12 cows, and a small adobe house with thick walls that stayed cool in summer and held warmth through the bitter desert winters. He had raised Josie there alone after her mother died of fever when Josie was 3, a loss that had hollowed something out of Abel that never quite filled back in, though he carried it quietly, the way he carried most things, and poured whatever he might have given a wife into the patient, daily work of teaching his daughter how to live in a country that demanded competence before it offered comfort. He taught her to read the sky for weather, to feel the soil for moisture, to listen to the spring the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat, for changes in flow, in clarity, in the faint mineral taste that shifted with the seasons, and told you, if you knew how to listen, whether the mountain snowpack was generous that year or thin. Teaching her everything he knew about the land and the water, and the particular patience required to make a living in country that did not forgive mistakes or reward impatience. Abel had died 2 years ago, quietly, the way he had done most things, sitting in his chair on the porch one evening, watching the sun go down behind the ridge, the way he always did, and simply not getting up again. Josie had found him there the next morning, still facing west, and had buried him on the hillside above the spring, where he could see the water he had spent his life protecting, and the farm he had built around it, and the mountains beyond that he had always said were the reason he stayed in a country most sensible people would have left years ago. She had not considered leaving. The farm was not just property, it was the only home she had ever known. The only connection she still had to a father whose quiet competence she was still learning to match, and the spring, more than the house or the garden or the small herd of dairy cows, was the heart of everything. Without the water, the farm was 40 acres of dust. With it, it was a life. She managed the accounts herself, in the same careful hand Abel had used, recording every sale and every expense in a ledger she kept on the kitchen table, and the numbers, while never comfortable, had remained on the right side of solvency through both growing seasons, a fact she took quiet pride in, though she would not have said so aloud, because pride, Abel had taught her, was a thing best demonstrated by the work itself, rather than by talking about it. She rose before dawn most mornings, and did not stop working until the light failed, and on the days when the work felt too large for one person, which was most days, she reminded herself that her father had done it alone, for 3 years after her mother died, and that if he could manage it with a toddler on his hip, she could certainly manage it without one. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and possessed of the particular stubbornness that comes from growing up as the only child of a widower, who treated her not as a daughter to be sheltered, but as a partner to be taught. And she had kept the farm running through 2 full growing seasons on her own, selling vegetables and milk and cheese to the families of Piñon Flats with the same steady reliability Abel had been known for, and earning, if not wealth, at least the quiet respect of a community that understood how much work it took to coax anything green out of this particular stretch of New Mexico dirt. The trouble arrived, as trouble often did in the territories, in the form of cattle, specifically in the form of a man named Cyrus Wexford, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county, and who had spent the better part of the past decade acquiring, by purchase or by pressure, most of the grazing land and water rights within a day's ride of Piñon Flats. Wexford was not a man who raised his voice often. He did not need to. He had learned, through long practice, that money spoke loudly enough on its own, and that in a territory where the law was thin, and the courts were far away, and a disputed land claim could take years to resolve through proper channels, a man willing to apply the right kind of pressure, at the right moment, could accomplish in weeks what the legal system would take seasons to sort out. He had acquired his empire piece by piece, ranch by ranch, water right by water right, always through transactions that were technically legal, even when they were not, by any honest measure, fair, buying out ranchers who could not afford to fight him, challenging claims he knew were valid simply because the cost of defending them exceeded what the claimant could bear, and waiting, with the patient confidence of a man who understood that time itself was a weapon when deployed against people with less of it than he had. The man who controlled the water controlled everything that depended on it, which in the high desert meant everything. Wexford had been aware of the Hartwell Spring for years. It was difficult not to be, since it was one of only 3 reliable water sources within 15 miles of town. But Abel Hartwell had been a man whose quiet, unshakable claim to his own property had made him a poor target for the kind of pressure Wexford preferred to apply. Abel had his papers in order, his fences maintained, and a reputation in town for being exactly the kind of man you did not bother unless you were prepared to be told, politely and firmly, to mind your own business. Josie, Wexford calculated, would be easier. The approach, when it came, was not crude. Wexford did not ride up to the Hartwell farm with armed men or make threats over a fence line. He was considerably more sophisticated than that. Instead, he filed a formal challenge to the Hartwell water claim at the Territorial Land Office, arguing that Abel's original 1862 filing was defective, that the boundaries described in the claim did not match the actual location of the spring, that the filing predated the current territorial water code and had never been properly updated, and that the spring, by rights, fell within the boundaries of adjacent land that Wexford had acquired 2 years earlier from a rancher who had been only too happy to sell, once Wexford made clear that the alternative to selling was considerably less pleasant. The challenge required a hearing at the county land office in Pinon Flats, and it was at this hearing, on a hot Tuesday morning in late June, that Josie Hartwell found herself standing across a wooden counter from Cyrus Wexford, holding her father's original water claim, the same document Abel had filed 23 years earlier, kept in a tin box beneath the floorboards of the adobe house, because Abel had always believed that a man's most important papers should be kept where he could find them in the dark. The land office was a single room at the back of the territorial courthouse, barely large enough for a counter, a desk, 2 filing cabinets, and a half-dozen wooden chairs that had seen considerably better days. A map of the county hung on the wall behind the counter, its boundaries redrawn so many times in pencil that parts of it were nearly illegible, and the air smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the particular dry heat that seeped through adobe walls in summer. Staffed by a county recorder named Whitmore, who had held the position for 11 years, and who approached every dispute that came before him with the cautious, non-committal manner of a man who understood that his job was to record facts, not to take sides, and who had seen enough land disputes in the territory to know that taking sides was, for a man in his position, the fastest route to unemployment, or worse. Wexford arrived with a lawyer from Santa Fe, a stack of surveyor's reports, and the easy confidence of a man who had done this kind of thing before and knew how it ended. Josie arrived alone, with her father's claim in one hand and nothing else, because she could not afford a lawyer, and because she had not imagined, until she walked into the room and saw the lawyer and the surveyor's reports, that she would need one. "Miss Hartwell," Wexford said, his voice carrying the particular warmth that powerful men sometimes use when addressing people they do not consider equals. "I want you to understand that I have no personal quarrel with you, or with your father's memory, but the facts are the facts. This claim," he gestured toward the document in her hand with the casual dismissiveness of a man waving away a fly, "is a piece of paper your father filed before most of the current water law existed. It doesn't meet current standards, the boundaries don't match the survey, and frankly, it wouldn't hold up in any court in the territory. I'm offering you a fair price for the land. I'd suggest you take it." Josie looked at the document in her hand, her father's careful handwriting, the territorial seal, the date, and then at Wexford, and then at Recorder Whitmore, who was studying his own desk with the intense focus of a man trying very hard not to be involved. "My father filed this claim legally," she said, her voice steady, despite the fact that her hands were not entirely so. "He built his life around that water. I'm not selling, Mr. Wexford, and I'm not giving up a right that was granted before you ever set foot in this territory." Wexford's lawyer produced his stack of surveyor's reports with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Miss Hartwell, the survey clearly shows that the spring sits outside the boundaries described in your father's original filing. The claim, as recorded, covers land roughly 200 yards east of the spring's actual location. Whether your father intended to claim the spring or not, what he actually claimed, on paper, is a patch of empty scrubland with no water on it at all." Josie stared at the survey, trying to make the lines and numbers match the land she had walked every day of her life. She knew where the spring was. She knew where the house was. She knew her father had not made that kind of mistake. But the paper in front of her, with its official stamps and precise measurements, said otherwise, and she did not have the technical knowledge to explain why. "That's not right," she said, but she could hear how thin the words sounded, in a room full of men holding documents she did not know how to challenge. "Miss Hartwell," Wexford said, leaning forward with the patient, almost paternal tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone he considers incapable of understanding it. "Your father was a good man, I'm sure. But good intentions don't make up for bad paperwork. This claim is worth less than the paper it's written on, and I think you know it. I wonder how many of you listening right now know what it feels like to be told that something your family built, something real, something you can see and touch and remember, doesn't count, because the paperwork doesn't match someone else's version of the truth. If that's ever happened to you, or to someone you love, I'd like to hear about it in the comments." Josie gathered her father's claim, folded it carefully, and placed it inside her coat without answering, because there was nothing left to say in a room where the other side had lawyers and surveyors, and she had nothing but a 23-year-old piece of paper, and the certainty, which she could feel, but could not prove, that her father had not been wrong. She did not notice, as she turned to leave, the man standing near the doorway of the land office, a man in a plain traveling coat and a dust-colored hat, who had been waiting, apparently, for his own appointment with the recorder, and who had watched the entire exchange with the particular stillness of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at, and was already deciding what to do about it. His name was Malcolm Gray. He had come to Pinon Flats on business entirely unrelated to water claims or cattle barons. He was evaluating mineral rights along the eastern slope of the mountains north of town, one of several dozen such evaluations he conducted each year across the Western Territories, in connection with a land and mining investment company he had built over 20 years, into one of the largest in the region. He understood territorial land law the way most men understood the weather, instinctively, from long exposure, and with a particular sensitivity to the signs that indicated when something was about to go wrong. What he had just watched go wrong in the Pinon Flats land office had nothing to do with defective paperwork and everything to do with a surveyor's report that did not, to Malcolm's experienced eye, look quite right. Survey boundaries in the territories were tied to physical landmarks, ridgelines, creek beds, rock formations, and the landmarks described in Wexford's survey did not match, in several small but significant ways, the landmarks Malcolm himself had noted while riding through the area earlier that week. The discrepancies were subtle, the kind of thing a county recorder with no surveying background would not catch, and the kind of thing a rancher's hired surveyor might introduce deliberately if the goal was not accuracy but advantage. Malcolm said nothing about any of this at the hearing. He was not a man who acted on suspicion when evidence was available, and evidence, in matters of land law, lived in archives rather than in arguments. Over the following week, Malcolm made quiet inquiries. He rode out to the Hartwell property himself, and spent an afternoon walking the land with a compass and a surveyor's chain he had borrowed from a hardware store in town, comparing the physical landmarks, the limestone ridge, the creek bed, the old boundary cairns Abel Hartwell had stacked along his property line decades earlier, against the descriptions in both Abel's original claim and Wexford's surveyor's report. The results confirmed what he had suspected. Abel's claim matched the land perfectly. Every landmark Abel had described, the limestone ridge, the old juniper that marked the northeast corner, the dry creek bed that formed the southern boundary, stood exactly where the claim said it would, unchanged in 23 years, because rock and water and the roots of old trees did not move to suit the ambitions of cattlemen. The spring itself sat squarely within the claimed boundaries, as it always had, fed by the same underground channel that had been running since long before Abel Hartwell or Cyrus Wexford, or anyone else had thought to argue about who it belonged to. Wexford's survey did not. The discrepancy was not an error. It was a deliberate shift of the boundary lines, roughly 200 yards to the east, designed to place the spring just outside the area Abel had claimed, and just inside the adjacent parcel Wexford had acquired. He visited the Territorial Archive in Santa Fe next, a 2-day ride each way through country that Malcolm knew well from years of mineral surveys and land evaluations. The same high desert Abel Hartwell had crossed decades earlier. The same dry arroyos and distant mesas and wide, patient sky that made a person, if they had any sense at all, understand why water mattered here in a way it simply did not matter in places where rain came reliably and rivers ran year-round, and requested the original recording of Abel Hartwell's 1862 water claim, not the copy Josie carried, but the official record filed with the territory. The clerk, a meticulous older man who took considerable pride in the organization of his archive, produced the document within the hour. It matched Josie's copy exactly, down to the last boundary marker, and it included one additional detail that the copy did not: a surveyor's certification, filed separately and cross-referenced to the claim, confirming that the boundaries described in the filing had been physically verified at the time of recording, and that they included the spring. Malcolm also obtained, while he was in Santa Fe, the credentials of the surveyor who had produced Wexford's report, a man named Dunlap, based in Albuquerque, and learned, through a brief conversation with a land attorney he had worked with on previous matters, that Dunlap had produced similar boundary-shifting surveys for 2 other Wexford land acquisitions in the territory over the previous 3 years, each time conveniently repositioning a disputed landmark just far enough to favor Wexford's claim. He did not confront Wexford directly. He had learned, over 2 decades of business in the territories, that confrontation was a tool best reserved for situations where evidence was insufficient. And in this case, the evidence was more than sufficient. It simply needed to be presented in a way that could not be dismissed, disputed, or quietly buried by a man with enough money to make inconvenient documents disappear. Instead, he did 2 things. First, he filed a formal objection to the boundary challenge with the Territorial Land Office, attaching the original archived claim, the surveyor's certification Abel had filed in 1862, and a detailed comparison showing the specific discrepancies between the actual landmarks and the landmarks described in Wexford's hired survey. The objection was filed in the name of the territory's own archive, not in Malcolm's name, making it a matter of official record rather than a private dispute. Second, he purchased, through his investment company, 3 parcels of land surrounding the Hartwell property, land Wexford had been planning to acquire as part of a larger consolidation of water rights in the area. The purchases were made at fair market value, through standard transactions that drew no particular attention. Malcolm's investment company bought land across the territories regularly enough that 3 more parcels in a small New Mexico valley would not have raised an eyebrow at any of the banks or title offices involved. He paid cash, closed quickly, and recorded the deeds within the week, creating a paper trail that was, by design, entirely unremarkable to anyone who did not understand the specific geography of who owned what water in the Pinon Flats Valley. But their effect was immediate. Wexford's plan to control all water access in the valley was now blocked by a landowner with considerably more resources and considerably less willingness to be pressured than Josie Hartwell had been assumed to be. The second hearing at the county land office, called 3 weeks after the first to address Malcolm's filing, was attended by considerably more people than the original proceeding. Word had spread through Pinon Flats that something unusual was happening with the Hartwell water claim, and the small room at the back of the courthouse was standing room only by the time Recorder Whitmore called the session to order. Wexford arrived with his lawyer and his surveyor. Josie arrived alone again, though this time Ruth Callahan, a neighboring widow who ran a small goat farm 2 miles down the road and who had been one of Abel's closest friends in the years before his death, had been the first person Josie told about the boundary challenge. And Ruth's reaction, A long silence followed by a single, carefully chosen profanity that Josie had never heard her use before, had told Josie everything she needed to know about how someone with 40 years of experience in the territory viewed Wexford's claim. Ruth had brought tamales and coffee, and had sat with Josie at the kitchen table for the better part of an evening, not offering solutions, because there were none she could see, but simply being present in the way that mattered most, when a person was facing something too large to face alone. 3 other small farmers in the valley, all of whom depended on seasonal water that flowed downstream from Josie's spring, had expressed their concern as well, not publicly, because none of them could afford to draw Wexford's attention to their own operations, but privately, in the careful, guarded way that people express solidarity when the person they are afraid of has more power than all of them combined. Ruth, and who had known Abel since before Josie was born, came with her and sat beside her in the front row, saying nothing but being present in the way that mattered. Malcolm Gray arrived last, carrying a leather folder, and took a seat near the back without introducing himself to anyone. Wexford's lawyer presented his case again, with the same confidence as before, citing the surveyor's report and the boundary discrepancy. When he finished, Recorder Whitmore turned to Josie and asked whether she had any new evidence to present. Before Josie could answer, Malcolm stood. "I'd like to present evidence on behalf of the Territorial Archive," he said, in the same quiet, unhurried tone he used for most of his business. He opened the leather folder and placed the original 1862 filing, the surveyor's certification, and his own boundary comparison on the counter, document by document, explaining each one with the patient clarity of a man who understood that facts, presented plainly, did not need volume to be persuasive. The room was very quiet by the time he finished. Several of the ranchers in attendance, men who had watched Wexford's land acquisitions expand across the valley for years, without ever seeing anyone produce evidence strong enough to challenge them, exchanged glances that carried the particular weight of people who were reconsidering, in real time, assumptions they had held for a very long time. One of the small farmers who depended on water downstream from the Hartwell Spring, a man named Ortega, who ran a small hay operation, and who had come to the hearing expecting to watch Josie lose her claim the same way he fully expected to lose his own someday, leaned forward in his chair and did not lean back again for the rest of the proceedings. Wexford's lawyer asked to examine the documents. Recorder Whitmore granted the request, and the lawyer spent several long minutes reading them, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something considerably less comfortable. "These documents," Malcolm continued, addressing the room rather than Wexford directly, "confirm that Abel Hartwell's original claim was properly filed, properly surveyed, and properly recorded, and that the spring has always been within its boundaries. The survey submitted by Mr. Wexford's surveyor contains deliberate boundary shifts that do not match the physical landmarks on the ground. I have walked the property myself and verified this." He paused. "I would add that the surveyor in question, Mr. Dunlap, has produced similar boundary-shifting reports for at least 2 other land acquisitions in this territory, all involving Mr. Wexford's interests. The Territorial Land Office may wish to review those filings as well." Cyrus Wexford sat very still for a long moment, his face carrying the expression of a man who has just discovered that the game he thought he was playing had more pieces on the board than he accounted for. His lawyer whispered something to him. Wexford did not respond. Ruth Callahan, sitting beside Josie, let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since the hearing began, and placed one weathered hand on Josie's arm without a word. Recorder Whitmore, who had spent 11 years carefully avoiding taking sides in land disputes, looked at the documents on his counter, looked at Wexford, looked at Josie, and made, for what may have been the first time in his career, a decisive statement. The room held its breath. Whitmore was not a man given to dramatic pronouncements. He had spent 11 years avoiding them. but the documents on his counter left no room for the kind of careful, non-committal language he usually preferred. And he seemed to understand, looking out at the standing room crowd, that this particular moment required something more than a stamped form and a filing reference. The Hartwell water claim stands as originally recorded. This challenge is dismissed. Cyrus Wexford withdrew his boundary challenge before the week was out, though the withdrawal itself was a considerably less dignified process than Wexford had likely imagined when he first filed it. His lawyer in Santa Fe, having reviewed Malcolm's evidence and the Territorial Archive's records, advised him in writing that continuing the challenge would expose him to a counterclaim for filing a fraudulent survey, which carried penalties under territorial law that Wexford's lawyer described, in the careful language lawyers use when they want to convey urgency, without creating a document that might later be used against their client, as potentially significant. Wexford withdrew through his lawyer rather than in person, though he did so through his lawyer rather than in person, and the formal investigation into Dunlap's survey practices that followed kept both men occupied with territorial authorities for the better part of the following year. Two other families whose land had been acquired through similar boundary disputes filed their own challenges in the months that followed, each one citing the Hartwell precedent and the Territorial Archive's records that Malcolm's filing had brought to light. Ortega, the small hay farmer who had leaned forward in his chair during the hearing and never leaned back, was among them. His own water access had been quietly reduced by a Wexford acquisition 2 years earlier, and he had assumed, until watching the Hartwell hearing unfold, that there was nothing to be done about it. The precedent Josie's case established changed that assumption for him and for others like him across the valley, and the cumulative effect, over the year that followed, was a slow but measurable rebalancing of water access in the region that benefited not just Josie, but every small farmer downstream of Wexford's holdings. Citing the Hartwell precedent, and at least one of those cases resulted in the return of land that had been improperly transferred, Josie kept her farm. In the year that followed, freed from the shadow of the boundary dispute and the constant, grinding anxiety of wondering whether each season might be the last, she expanded the garden for the first time since Abel's death, adding a new plot of chili peppers that Ruth Callahan had suggested and that turned out, to Josie's surprise, to be the most profitable crop the farm had ever produced. She hired a boy from town, the Ortega family's eldest son, to help with the dairy work 2 mornings a week, and she began, tentatively, to imagine a future for the farm that extended beyond simple survival, something Abel had always talked about, but had never quite had the resources to pursue. The spring continued to run, as it always had, steady and reliable through the driest summers, and the garden continued to supply half the town's produce, and the dairy cows continued to give milk, and the small adobe house with the thick walls continued to hold warmth through the desert winters, exactly as Abel had built it to do. She kept her father's original water claim in a simple wooden frame on the wall above the kitchen table, the same table where Abel had eaten his meals and done his accounts and taught his daughter, year by patient year, how to read the land and the water and the sky, with the same careful attention he brought to everything. The document was creased now, and faded, and the ink of Abel's signature had turned the particular brown that old ink turns, after enough years of being kept in a tin box beneath a floorboard. But it was legible, and it was real, and it was hers, the last thing her father's hands had made that still had the power to protect her, the same way his hands had protected her for 20 years before that, building walls and mending fences and gentling animals, and holding hers when she was small enough to need holding. It was proof, Josie thought every time she looked at it, that her father had known exactly what he was doing when he filed it 23 years ago, even if it had taken the rest of the world a little longer to agree. Malcolm Gray continued to hold the surrounding parcels he had purchased, not as a speculative investment, but as a buffer a permanent barrier against any future attempt to consolidate the valley's water rights into a single pair of hands. He visited Piñon Flats from time to time in the years that followed, always on legitimate business, and always stopping by the Hartwell farm on his way through, where Josie, who had eventually learned from Ruth Callahan and from the territorial attorney's correspondence exactly who the quiet stranger in the land office had been, always had coffee waiting and a chair on the porch with a view of the spring and the ridge and the mountains beyond. They talked, on those visits, about water and weather and the price of hay, and the particular stubbornness of dairy cows who refused to be milked by anyone other than the person they were accustomed to. And occasionally, when the evening was warm enough and the coffee strong enough, about Abel, about the kind of man he had been, and the kind of claim he had filed, and the quiet, steady foresight of a father who had understood, 23 years before anyone challenged it, that the most important thing he could leave his daughter was not land or money, but proof, properly recorded and carefully kept, that the water was hers. Whether anything more than friendship grew between the landman who bought 3 parcels to protect a stranger's water and the farmer's daughter who refused to sell what her father had built, the people of Piñon Flats never quite determined, and neither Malcolm nor Josie ever felt the need to tell them. Some things, Josie had come to believe, were like the spring itself. They ran quietly, beneath the surface, and the people who depended on them understood their value without needing to be told. That's where we'll leave Josie Hartwell, her father's water still running, and her father's name still on the claim, and the quiet stranger who proved that the only lie in the room had never been hers. If you were listening to this story while doing something else today, maybe watering a garden of your own, or sitting somewhere quiet as the evening comes in, or just resting after a long day, I'd love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what kept your hands busy while this story kept you company. And if you don't mind sharing, I'd love to know what part of the world you're joining us from today. These stories have traveled further than I ever imagined, and hearing where you're listening from always means more than you'd think. If stories about quiet strength, about people who refuse to give up what their families built, are the kind that stay with you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if today's story was worth your time, a like helps this small channel more than you might expect. Thank you truly for riding along with me today, for spending this time with Josie and Abel, and the quiet stranger who knew that the truth, like water, finds its own level if you give it enough time. Until the next trail,